Epidemic are both a standalone business risk and an amplifier of existing trends and vulnerability. How do you see this situation?
That's right, Sanat. So, in addition to the serious nature of the COVID-19 pandemic and the health risks associated with it, we know that there are several economic implications that we have to deal with in the wake of the pandemic. So, in terms of a standalone business risk, COVID-19 began as a shock to production in the Chinese economy. And because of the interconnected nature of global production, trade, and the global economy, we have seen that a successive series of demand and supply shocks have manifested, have been unleashed on the global economy. Let's take a moment to think about some of these supply and demand shocks that Indian businesses, along with many other economies, are now exposed to. On the supply side, we see that because of the nature of the infection, worker productivity and the availability of labor has been severely constrained in the short run. That means that production cannot go on as normal. In fact, the very nature of collective production, that is manufacturing in high density settings, is not plausible as long as the virus is amongst us. On the other hand, the second effect, and I think more important one, has been because of the supply chain linkages with China and the global nature of supply chains. Businesses in India and elsewhere rely on raw inputs, intermediate goods, and final goods from supply chains. And with the global disruption on supply chains, we have seen that the business risk has been magnified. Whatever goods Indian businesses would like to produce, at some point or the other, these shortages are expected to manifest in their production cycles. On the demand side, the story is quite different, and you must have heard a lot of people characterizing this problem as a demand problem, right? Yes. So just like I gave you the example of the collective production limitations, there's also limitations on collective consumption. So there's a typology of effect. We know that certain services firms have been more forcibly hit. And the reason for that is the very nature of consumption in services involves associating with individuals. It's in a collective setup. And hence, consumer demand has suffered because of that limitation, yes. Practical limitation. In addition to that, there's also a loss of there's a shift in consumer preference and a loss of consumer demand because of government measures related to restrictions and lockdowns, which are clearly needed across the world. So we've seen a dip in consumer demand. So this is what has happened because of the pandemic. Yes. But let us also try and appreciate what was happening in the world before COVID. Yes. So we were amidst one of the highest levels of uncertainty, business uncertainty, because of trade and investment policy tensions. We were seeing increase in restrictions across the globe. This applies to mostly foreign companies, but that was a clear uptrend in that sense. There was flagging global growth. As you know, predictions for global growth were already quite modest, and the pandemic has now forced the world into a global recession. So in that way, it is a magnifier of what was the story that was already being scripted, and it has taken the decline to a completely new level. And just to put this in context, I think recent estimates from the IMF show that global growth is projected at negative 3%. Yes. In comparison to estimates as recently as December 2019 or January 2020, this is a significant downward revision, which has happened in a period of one quarter, that is 3 months. And I think it's a serious situation.
Yeah, indeed, because the global supply chains also affected. And if we talk about a particular country, like emerging countries like India, they are also struggling with that. So it's like demand and supply both, obviously the part of scissors, we can say, as Marshall suggested. So we cannot say that this is a demand side or a supply side. So they come both at the same
Right.
time.
Right, and that's the very nature of this pandemic, which makes it quite severe. That
Yes.
the sources of disruption emanate both on the supply side and demand side, which then means that policy um, should as much attend to supply as much to consumer demand. And there are many prescriptions about this, and there are many things we know, and I believe we can touch upon some of those in the
Yes.
remaining part of the session.